Hello, everyone. We're going to start the webinar now. I'm Nisha Thaplyal, and I will be your host and facilitator today. I would like to start by acknowledging the country on which we're meeting, the land, the waterways, and the airways of the many First Nations on which we work, study, live, and gather for this event, including the traditional custodians of the Dharawal and Kulin nations. We would like to pay our respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. We would like to pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may have joined us today. Hello again, welcome, Jai Bhim. My name is Nisha Thaplyal, and I'm an academic in the School of Education at the University of Newcastle. I teach and do research about transformative education or the kinds of educational processes that contribute to social change, and specifically the transformation of historically unequal societies. I also refer to my work using the language of critical education, social justice education, anti-oppression education. And these are just terms and language that I've acquired from the different spaces and cultures that have contributed to my formation as an educator, both in India, but also in other parts of the world. And particularly, I have to acknowledge through my experiences as an academic, a migrant academic, to two settler colony nation states, the United States and Australia. I should also say that in this approach, when we're talking about social change, we're certainly talking about the kinds of education that bring about individual transformation. Sometimes we refer to it as awareness raising or conscientization, but it also involves larger processes of change, changing cultures, changing the institutions and the systems that normalize and justify social inequality and injustice. From this perspective, the perspective that I work from, education is always political and can occur anywhere, not just in formal institutions like university and school classrooms. It involves fundamentally becoming aware of how we have been socialized through our schooling, through our formal education, also in other spaces of socialization, including family, media, and so forth, how we've been socialized to normalize inequality and injustice. And most of the traditions, the social justice education traditions that I draw on have actually emerged from sites of collective struggle or social movements of historically oppressed groups. And that includes, of course, the anti-caste movement, but also the struggles of women, First Nations people, working class struggles, queer struggles, and so forth. And these are also some of the spaces that I document in my research on social movements for public education. So that's just a little bit of background to where we are today and this webinar series, which comes out of my current research, which seeks to map resistance to transnational Hindutva in the global Indian diaspora. And through this research, I've been privileged to meet very inspiring activists, some of whom have agreed to do this webinar series with me, and some of whom are joining us today. The title, of course, for this webinar series, as I'm sure most of you have guessed, is inspired by Baba Saheb Ambedkar's call to educate, agitate, and organize, to struggle for social justice, for freedom, and the reclamation of the human personality. Today, because we're going to talk about the challenging and complex work of anti-casteist education, I also want to invoke Savitribai Phule, and particularly her poem, Rise to Learn and Act, which is published in her Kavya Phule collection of poems. And in this poem, she talks about, she calls to us to awake, arise, and educate. And the word awake speaks to me particularly to the theme of this conversation we're about to have, because to me, it speaks about the need to become aware of how we've been taught to look at the world, to see, and how to unlearn some of those problematic ways of seeing and making sense of who we are in relation to other people and other living beings on our planet. I feel very honored and privileged that the panelists we have with us today have accepted my invitation to this dialogue. Each one of them brings a wealth of knowledge and lived experience to this conversation. We're all troubled and involved in this work of educating about casteism, particularly in South Asian diaspora communities. Our goals for this dialogue are to share and exchange our knowledge and experiences, not to sort of come up with a one-size-fits-all model or some kind of best practice. We have a shared interest, I think, from the conversations we've had leading up to today in educating for solidarity, not supremacy. I think we also have a shared concern in the fact that there are organized efforts by the transnational Sangh Parivar to deny the reality of Brahminical supremacy and caste oppression, both historical and contemporary, in India and everywhere Indians have migrated to. Baba Saheb's warning has come true indeed, that everywhere Hindus go, the problem of caste has gone. But there are very powerful forces at play to silence and erase these lived realities of discrimination, exclusion, and brutal violence. So we all share a concern about that. But I think we're also, all of us together, inspired by the fact that we're living in a time where there is a global or a transnational anti-caste movement emerging, which is growing from strength to strength, and which of course is shaped and inspired by 1,000 years of struggle, in the anti-caste struggles that have come before our time. So I thank Kanika, Dilpreet, Vikrant and Mudit again for making time out of their very busy lives to join us today on a Saturday afternoon to talk about a very challenging but also a very inspiring topic. They are going to introduce themselves. So we'll get started now. And I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit about the spaces in which they do this education work around issues of caste and caste oppression. I'm going to request Kanika to start. Thank you, Kanika.
Thank you, Nisha, for inviting me to this event. And also, it's an honor to share this platform with some of the well-known activists I have, Vikrant, and I've got Mudit here, and I've got Dilpreet. So thank you so much. To begin with, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and extend that respect to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people today. It's really hard to describe yourself and introduce myself, but in brief, I'm an academic at the University of Melbourne. And my research so far has been on issues around socioeconomic disparities, and that extends from racial tensions to discriminations based on ageism. Some of my recent work is on modern slavery, which is an anti-law in Australia at the moment. A paper that I'm currently working as I speak to you all is about social dominance orientation, which is about caste-based hierarchies within a very noble services perspective, which is microfinances. So I do bring in my experiences and personal interest of casteist issues in my understanding of business theories and marketing philosophies. My experience throughout, and I would be sharing more of them, has always been inspired by Baba Saheb Ambedkar. And this particular movement that I have about educating the masses is also speaking more towards the Anglo-Australians or the diasporas outside Indians, because somewhere I feel that, you know, it's pretty hyped up when we talk about Black Lives Matters or we talk about social movements, but the caste issue does not get the mainstream media attention as other movements around it, and somewhere there is a suppression by a certain vested interest groups. So I use my education and this noble platform that I have of being an academic to educate people and inspire them and raise awareness about these tensions on caste issues. I mean, just to give you a brief example, within services marketing, which is the scholarly discipline I represent, there is an area called transformative service research, which is nothing but transforming the lives of people in equality sections. And when you look at the key authors around it, they're mostly white, supreme, or the upper caste Indians who represent this field. And so when you look at the agendas that these scholars have given us as junior scholars to pursue, caste issue was never raised. And so there is literally a suppression. I mean, there's a recognition about women's inequality. There's recognition of Black movements. There's a recognition that marketing theories have always been focusing on a certain elite class, right? We're talking about the higher elites of the society, but caste as such was never raised in any of the top tier journals. And just to add up to this conversation on academia, and this would probably set us the scene, is when we academics do write papers in top tier journals representing caste issues in services as such, where women from Dalit backgrounds are not given access to loans, because, you know, it's a very statistical discrimination. You can literally read out their last names and get to know that they are from a Dalit background. You know, these issues don't get discussed at the top tier journals because the authority that holds the review process of these top tier journals are the Subramanians and the Swamis. And so there's a general desk rejects that we face. So I'm glad that I am involved with such amazing experts here and the attendees who I kind of know some of them, and to kind of build an awareness from here on. So I'm going to just leave this conversation here and move on and ask others to introduce themselves. Thank you, Nisha.
Thank you, Kanika, and welcome again. Dilpreet, may I ask you to go next?
Yes, hi, thanks Kanika, thanks Nisha. My name is Dilpreet. I'm joining from Naam, which is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Born and raised in India, I came to Australia, I think late 2017 to do my master's in journalism. And last year, I founded South Asian Today, which is a media startup for South Asian women and non-binary people. And what I realized when I moved to Australia, it was the first time that I had ever left India. And, you know, you have this idea that the system of caste is only, you know, prevalent or dominant in Indian spaces or in South Asian spaces. I did not think even for a moment that I will find the same sort of, you know, structure and dominance outside of India as well, which was very fascinating to me because I had never ever stepped into the West before. All the, you know, specifically Indian self-appointed leaders that I met in Melbourne were all, you know, upper caste Hindus, and the conversations that they were having were so limited to Diwali parties or you know, chai brands, and there was no a conversation about you know, the caste system. And it's so bizarre because you can't have a conversation about South Asia without talking about caste. Like, it's actually impossible. But you know, the diaspora has found a way by saying that they don't know about it. So a lot of the young diaspora kids that I met, they were like, "Hame to pata hi nahi hai, what is caste? You know, we don't know." And they always say, "Oh, it must be a class system." So that's a huge what's the word? I think a myth that, caste system and the class system are both the same. And I was chatting with Mudit yesterday about this, that, the diaspora is often like, we don't know about caste, but you pick anything that the diaspora has ever created and it'll have, conversations about caste in it. For example, Dil, that's a dating app, a Tinder for South Asians in the West. And when you sign up to it, you have 20 categories. If the diaspora doesn't know about caste, how do they know about who is Brahmin and who is Jat and who is whatnot, right? So there is information. I think people know, people just don't want to admit it because that will involve, having some sort of guilt. And I think the whole conversation with South Asians in the West is limited to being white and limited to being brown, and brown people in the West do not want to acknowledge their caste locations, because that would mean that would mean they would have to admit to their oppressive side, which is what I find fascinating. Is that's what why I started South Asian Today. And I think we do tend to write pieces on South Asian politics through an anti-caste and through a gender perspective, and I think that's majorly missing in Australia. I will just close my introduction by giving you an example about how much journalism in Australia is missing the conversation about caste. I think a few months ago, I saw this piece that this person had done for a reputable newspaper. I will not take names. And, she had talked to a bunch of people about the anti-caste movement. And when I opened the piece, the main photo was her, and she was an upper caste person. So, these small things where, upper caste people in the West will talk about caste, but they will take the lead. So that irks me as a journalist. That really pisses me off, because if we really want to do journalism through an anti-caste perspective, it's important that we, the faces of the story remain the Dalit and Bahujan people and not upper caste journalists. So I'll speak more about that when we begin. Thanks.
Thanks, Dilpreet. Welcome. Vikrant, may I request you to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Nisha. And it was good to hear from both Kanika and Dilpreet. And before I start, I would also like to recognize the various traditional lands where we are located and acknowledge the elders past and present and emerging. I acknowledge the land, waterways, and airways of the Wurundjeri people and pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. And of course, I always, pay my respect to all our ancestors who really had to fight their way through to give us what we are. If today we are sitting here and talking about the caste prejudices and the caste issues, it is through their hard work and all the leaders and all people who have actually given us this platform where we can speak or we can live the life the way we wanted. So just to tell you briefly about myself, and I'll make it a bit more of a personal story as well. So I'm an academic, a filmmaker, photographer, author, and journalist. I really like calling myself all of these things. I like to capture stories of cultural flows and its impact on Indian diaspora in Australia now, currently. I'm working on a reflective documentary questioning caste and racism. I like generally to integrate traditional cultural practices with new media technologies to archive, create digital exposition, collaborate on multimedia exhibitions and festivals. But that's one thing I wanted to share, that these are the kind of online discussions that recently have been, partnering with other activists around and many other things that are there. So community, academia, films, articles, discussion forums, these are all the tools that I'm using in my work. My first master's film project was titled Pehchan/Identity. Okay, it was a personal exploration of how low caste status and the society's discriminatory and casteist outlook creates an identity crisis, often impacting adversely, leading to mental stress, anxiety, and subsequently for millions wanting to hide their so-called low caste status. My second film project, Yatharth, or Fact, focused on 3 students from Jamia Millia Islamia, Delhi and Delhi universities. 2 were Dalits and 1 Brahmin. They shared their perspectives on caste. It was a great eye-opener how systemic the caste oppression and discrimination was and is in the Indian universities of repute. Just during the filmmaking, and this is I'm talking about in 1997, one of our protagonists from Delhi University was beaten up in his hostel room because of being from low caste and being vociferous to raise his voice about various things and being talking about identity and talking about rights. So having his, and then he did not bow down to the pressure. And having his first-hand experience shared on camera was very emotional, heavy, yet inspiring, seeing the same person now doing some amazing work today in the field of Dalit education and politics is immensely gratifying and satisfying for me. My current focus is definitely to bring discussion around caste and discriminatory caste practices and caste baggage, as what Dilpreet and both Kanika mentioned, that migrants bring to Australia. This was not evident in the early South Asian migrants, but with a growing number, these issues have surfaced here, everywhere in Australia, or you may name everywhere. And there needs to be a continuous discussion and deliberation, as I believe if we take racism seriously and understand how evil it is, we must make an attempt to create an awareness about the evil of casteism and how the cultural baggage of casteism can be and has been problematic in the long run. Thanks.
Thank you, Vikrant. Welcome. Mudit, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mudit. I am in Melbourne. And yeah, I think everyone's already acknowledged the traditional custodians of the lands we are on. I would like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are from and not on. I was born in Udaipur, which is kind of the marble belt of Rajasthan. That land has been ravaged by parasite business interests for over 1,000 years now, especially by the mining industry trying to get out the stone from the lands of people that have been underrepresented in most of the policy matters and in circles of power. Two communities that have lost a lot but now have asserted themselves all over again are the Adivasi communities of the Meenas and the Bhils. And yeah, I would like to acknowledge their custodianship of the land I am from. Going ahead, I am in Melbourne and I am a cultural anthropologist at a university here. And my area of research is studying income and employment level inequalities within communities in the arts sector. So I do mostly quantitative analysis, which does help with theorization at times, which I guess I'll illustrate a little later. But the spaces I usually operate in are the graduate research space and the liberal democratic space, which is where white professors come across South Asians in 3 key spaces. And so, yeah, I'll explain the dynamic of why I'm bringing this particular thing up from the spaces I operate in. So white people mostly come across South Asian people as fellow faculty members, as university admins, and as activists. And most of these are lefty, progressive people. And yeah, but the problem is that, and I'm quite sure it's not a new problem and it's been acknowledged before, that these spaces are very homogeneous, and that the issue these people are speaking on, they're not speaking on their own complicity in the issues themselves. It feels like, especially from a white point of view, it feels like the issue of the people who are speaking on a certain issue, their complicity has already been resolved. And yeah, like Dilpreet said, the self-appointed nature of their spokespersonship, the South Asian people's spokespersonship in the diaspora, builds a monolithic image of a largely chill civil society with particularly no burning problems. And yeah, that's what I want to expose from the spaces I operate in. Maybe expose is not the right word, but the gaze, the oppressor caste gaze from a largely Brahmin academia abroad and in activist circles. What that does is it creates an illusion that caste is a subcontinental problem only. That problems of overrepresentation, so I'm not talking about underrepresentation because I'm going to study what my people have done. So the problem of overrepresentation, my community's overrepresentation, and how that homogenizes South Asian communities. they try to like project that only happens back home. It does not happen here. And also that they project that because we are acknowledging it, it means that we are not complicit because, oh, we are self-aware. But yeah, this kind of lamp shading is super problematic as well. And yeah, which makes people in the West especially look at South Asia without any critical capacity or like constructive critical capacity, right? And yeah, it makes it okay or legitimizes the fact that for an oppressor caste person without a dog in the fight sitting thousands of miles away, it is okay to study Dalit and Adivasi communities, but not study their own cultural complicity in the oppression itself. And so, yeah, as I go ahead with what I want to do, I hope to bring some critical self-reflection to these spaces. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Mudit, and welcome. I feel so privileged and honored to be in this conversation with each one of you. We only have 90 minutes together, but I've already learned so much, so thank you. As I shared before, I come to this conversation, from the discipline of education, which means that much of my teaching work has happened in formal educational spaces, the university classroom, but also I've been privileged to work in solidarity with social movements of historically oppressed groups, where I am certainly not there to teach, I am there to learn. And the lessons I've learned about power and privilege in those spaces are lessons that can't be learned from books and lectures, right? And I think some of you have spoken to that as well. In terms of in the diaspora, I should probably also share, and this is difficult because I haven't really talked about this in public before. So I'm the product of an interfaith union. I have a Brahmin Hindu father and a Parsi Zoroastrian mother, and I grew up in the Parsi Zoroastrian community. So my earliest recollections are being called Parda, which means outcast, right? Because my mother had married out, and the Parsis, when they arrived from what was then Persia, they adopted the worst practices of Brahminical Hinduism, namely the caste system and the patriarchy. So there was the culture developed a priest caste, the Dasturjis, an untouchable caste, who are the men and by association their families, who take care of those who passed on. We have towers of silence where we place our bodies to, for nature to take care of, the vultures. They're called the Khandyas, and they are a de facto untouchable caste in the Parsi community. And then there's the Parjats like me, who are stigmatized and excluded from all religious and community activities, right? So this, my work has always been very personal in that sense. These questions about how is this possible? Who gets to decide that my birth makes me inferior, right? And somebody else's birth makes them superior. So these questions go way back to my childhood, but it's not as simple as that. It's always easier to occupy, the position of the oppressed, but the reality is that I have a Brahmin surname, and outside my community, going all the way back to school, I became very quickly aware of the unearned advantages and privileges of that surname. Hindi and Sanskrit teachers would always comment on my surname, right? It was a sort of welcome, we know you. And I didn't always know why. And as soon as they heard my Parsi Hindi, then some of that status was lost very quickly. But there's no question that I have walked in both worlds. I continue to walk in both worlds. And I've experienced both privilege and discrimination. And that's what makes this work. That's why I do this work. That's what inspires this work. And one of the best tools that I have acquired in my journey is history. So when I started asking why are things the way they are, who gets to say that this is the way things are, right? And my mom and my grandmom, who were my first feminist teachers, pointed me to history. And they pointed out that these were man-made constructions. These truths were entirely man-made. And then that lesson was again reaffirmed when in adulthood, in my activist spaces, where we turn to what we call critical or radical histories to challenge the status quo. And ever since then, history has been a key part of my pedagogical toolbox, right? It's a very powerful tool to break these silences that all of you have already talked about. And of course, Baba Saheb said, those who forget history, we cannot make history if we forget history. I've just paraphrased him. So this is my next question for all of you. Could you please speak to how you use history in your work? And I'm going to ask Dilpreet to go first this time. Thank you, Dilpreet.
Sure. For me, to be very honest, I'm inspired by activists in this present day and age, especially in the internet. A few names. I love Tenmori Soundarajan's work from Equality Labs. Jyotsna Siddharth, they are a Dalit queer activist. They run Project Anti-Caste Love, and they talk about, intercaste love and faith and the challenges that it comes with. I really admire Anurag Minus Verma. His podcast is, probably the only podcast being led by a Dalit man in India right now. And he really digs deep into some of the very, anti-caste conversations that we need to be having. So for me, if I had to pick someone from history, and also I don't think there's only one person that I always focus on in my work. There are, tons of people that have inspired me. I'm not sure if anyone knows about Nangeli. She was an Ilava woman from back in the day, from the kingdom of, I think it's called Travancore, which, was formed of Kerala and Tamil Nadu. And her story was that, during the British Raj, in the British India, lower caste women had to pay breast tax, and they were not allowed to cover their breasts. They had to, be naked from up top in order to pay respect to the upper caste people, or, pay tax for existing. And the story goes that, when she refused to pay the breast tax, people went to her house and they were like, you can't do this. So in protest, she cut her breasts, and she was like, I'm not going to pay. So she cut her breasts off and she died. And, the story is not being recognized by India's history. I clearly remember that they tried to put a chapter on her, which was taken out. And it's often called like an urban legend. And but the reality is that her village exists. People in the village know her story. In fact, there are people who have ancestry to her. So I got to know about this story in 2016. I think BBC had done an article on it. And that was the first time I'd heard about her. And it really, I think it moved me, because I couldn't imagine a story like that being suppressed for generations, and it had been. And, I just couldn't believe that people didn't know about her enough, or couldn't believe that, people thought that that was not in fact real. So I think that's one historical, maybe perhaps moment or something that I heard about that, changed, I guess, something in me, perhaps. And another historical figure that I'm not a very religious person, but I'm born into Sikhism. And I often take inspiration from Guru Gobind Singh Ji. He was the 10th Guru, and he was the one who founded Khalsa, which, was a direct result of wanting to abolish caste. Unfortunately, that's not true. Sikh people are, some of the most casteist people ever. Punjabis are so casteist, we'll be the flag bearers of that. But that wasn't the intention. And I think the names Singh and Kaur were there to abolish the caste system, so that we don't have any more surnames, and that we, men are Sikh and women are Kaur. And of course, it's a gender binary. I'm talking 15th century. So these, some of the historical moments, some stories have moved me, my own religion to an extent, even though it's supremely problematic. But my day-to-day work is not heavily focused on history, if that makes sense. Primarily because, you know, journalism involves being involved in the present day and age and how things are moving now. I'm more inclined towards learning from people who are leading the anti-caste movement in this day and age.
Thank you, Dilpreet. Vikrant?
Thanks, Nisha, and thanks, Dilpreet, for that interesting story. And there are so many stories of Dalits which have been, you know, it has never been acknowledged or never been there. We are the generation, we have grown up reading Amar Chitra Katha and Panchatantra and Nandan, which was a sanitized version of storytelling of Hindu glory mostly. So unfortunately, I don't take any pride in those kind of stories. So firstly, I'll give credit of my own learning about history and that kind of thinking to my parents, both my father and my mother. My mother, she was an academic, Meera Kishore, she was a poet, and she did lots of, her particular thinking was all about not only poetry or romanticism, but also about talking about the rights and education within the Dalit community. My father being an administrative officer, and he worked quite a lot in cultural research, and his work in Chao area inspired me to take that particular aspect of dance, and I would really work on that. So yeah, so they have always inspired me to raise my voice and fight against injustice. The ongoing conversations at home with keywords such as inequality, discrimination, identity, and belonging was very educating and rewarding. It is through them that I became aware of many happenings and started questioning them. In their work, two notable figures were a constant, who are my heroes as well, Sant Ravidas and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And but my parents also educated us about the local indigenous and caste struggles. Thus, again, I have to, sorry, I forgot to share that. Well, yeah. So, people like Buddha, Sant Ravidas, Jyotiba and Savitri Phule, Sidhu Kanu, Birsa Munda, these are people from my state, from Jharkhand, who were really big indigenous fighter for indigenous rights and also fought against the British. So their work against the British has been always highlighted, but never about the kind of work they were doing to get the rights of the indigenous people. So that's another kind of whitewashing which has happened over the years. So if I also look at the work, father of the Indian Constitution and champion of social reforms, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and his work has been really inspiring. And in 2007, in his 1935 work, he said that turn in any direction you like. Caste is the monster that crosses your path. You cannot have political reform. You cannot have economic reform unless you kill this monster. And now I generally use caste is something, it's a monster that crosses your path or crosses your path wherever South Asians go. So unfortunately, caste has now gone global as well. So I would also recommend the work of Isabel Wilkerson. And this has taken the world by storms because it just recently came out. And suddenly one thing that was alien to the Western world, they were discussing an analysis taking place based on Wilkerson's finding about how caste, we talked about racism, but how is she trying to, do a comparison of racism and caste, and is caste a reality in America? And, you saw people like Oprah Winfrey and others, talking about it. So I was like, wow, this is a kind of a good read. And I went and read this and quite a good eye opener. And she borrows quite a lot from the Indian caste system or the Hindu caste system. So in his seminal work, Suraj Yengde on global caste quotes Wilkerson. She says, the division of American society is primarily caste-based, which acts as an architecture of human hierarchy, the subconscious code of instructions for maintaining. And Yengde adds, in our case, a 400-year-old social order or more. Yengde goes on to define global caste as a layered mechanism of immovable social hierarchy and absolute control that aims to dehumanize certain forms of labor through both structural and economic positions, as well as through the cultural practices of endogamy and ritual. So what we learn through these kind of writers or particular workers is that, especially the contemporary thing which is coming out through the perspective or the lens of the South Asians, is that diasporic South Asians, is that cultural baggage of discriminatory caste practice continues till date wherever it travels. The dehumanization of the Dalits have long history. The struggle of Dalits is never ending. Finding collaborators in researching and putting forward the issues of caste and Dalits, especially for us in foreign land, is important so that many of these casteists that avail benefit in the name of minority and multiculturalism in a liberal democratic setup, paying lip service to the cause of racism and indigenous issues, must accept and come out of their casteist mindset. Thank you.
Thanks, Vikrant. Seriously taking notes. Thank you. I think it's Mudit next, right? Thank you, Mudit.
I am going to talk about an inspiration who's also a historical figure, and also quite a controversial, derided figure in a lot of circles. Bindeshwari Prasad Mandal was an OBC person who wrote the Mandal Commission report that was given to the Congress government, but was later implemented by a third front government, which brought in reservation in jobs in 1990 for other backward classes and in education for other backward classes in 2007. Why I'm inspired by Dr. Mandal's work is precisely because a lot of people, especially in the diaspora, academics talk about whenever there is a discussion of caste, they end up talking about, and yeah, obviously in a self-appointed manner, they end up talking about issues of Dalits. But do they even understand what the scheduled caste community is? What communities it is made up of? Is it a monolith or not? Who are the Adivasis? Who are the other backward classes? And why do they deserve representation? So BP Mandal himself was from quite a well-to-do family, and which is why I wanted to bring his name up, because when he wrote the report, he said, it is not, when we talk about affirmative action, it is not about having a poverty alleviation program in place. It is about representation in terms of having a seat at the table and talking about your problems, your community's problems. Do you have that kind of power? If you don't, then your material wealth also does not matter. And this is precisely the reason for the graded inequality that we will, I guess, touch upon as we go ahead. But the graded inequality within jatis or castes exists because, like Vikrant mentioned, there is a dehumanizing factor that operates. Because someone thinks they're superior to someone else, so they can collaborate with some other people and eliminate or like leave out a certain number of people or certain communities from certain kinds of representations. Only when all of these people have a seat at the table can they talk as collaborators, as people who have fraternity between them, or as people who are in opposition, but they do have a seat at the table. And that is what Dr. Mandal did with what he did. So yeah, anyone who opposed or still opposes or does not understand Dr. Mandal's work, I really urge them to read up or go ahead and read like an executive summary of his report. It is quite amazing. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Mudit. Kanika?
Thank you, everyone. I think some of my favorite historians has already been named by you all. And just to tell you, I'm not a historian, as Nisha said she is, but I do get inspired by a lot of the works they do. And the aim here is to build on an interdisciplinary trajectory where you draw on the works of these contemporary writers and link them to marketing philosophies. And this is where I come into the picture. And this is probably where I'm driving my research. And so I was very happy that Vikrant mentioned Isabella Wilkinson, because she has raised the issues right at the core, at the heart of the conversation, and has shaken a lot of those RSS movements that you see in the US, where there's a certain mainstream attention given to her book, and there's a certain anxiety amongst the so-called RSS community. So there's a great mention, and I have read the book, and it's an impressive one. Some names that I picked, because being an academic, I'm thrown to a lot of literature that I read across in social medias and academic journals, but I do pick and choose some that have inspired me as a Dalit woman. So a bit biased towards feminist Dalit movements here, and I do like to pick interesting pieces written on unique perspectives. Like some names, if I have to throw in, that have inspired me over the period is Kumud Paude. If you know her, she's an Ambedkarite who has studied Sanskrit, which was so long a language privileged by the elite class, and kind of breaking the barriers there, that you can read a literature which was so long meant for a certain community. Shiva Kami is another Dalit published novelist. Particularly Taming of Women was the book I picked up, not knowing who she was, at the airport in India, and being inspired by some of the themes she draws on. But again, when I read these Dalit feminist scholars, I think it all comes down to Baba Sahib and ignoring the foundation of the work he does. And I consider Baba Sahib as a great historian. He's been an economist, he's been an historian, he's also been a modern feminist. Imagine having a conversation back in those days when Manusmriti was the text used by people, and speaking about women's rights and speaking about modernizing India, and the kind of if there was Twitter back then, what would be the reactions? He would be memed in different ways. So I cannot though I read these modern scholars all the time, and I love to as much as possible, I do draw connections back to Inhelination of Caste, as you can see on my background, as to what were the points that Baba Sahib was drawing on, and how that has inspired us over the period. So I think a historian, it comes down to Baba Sahib, and I try and link his economic perspectives, Marxist perspectives, to marketing philosophies, because we very typically in marketing teach about caste as some sort of segmentation is the basic foundation that I teach my students. And I wonder, where did this philosophy come from about segmenting people and then creating products to a particular segment? It is a casteist philosophy around it. So again, just to stick to the question itself, a historian, of course, the contemporary writers that keep providing great work on Dalit feminist movement, but also coming back to Baba Sahib and reading Inhelination of Caste again and again. And each time I read, I'm thrown in different directions, because you have to read the book multiple times to understand his true perspective of what he wants to lay out. It's a very tough and a heavy literature to read. So here is my response to your question. Yeah.
Thank you, dear panelists, for answering this question.
As I think almost all of you have pointed out, the education system has historically, the mass education as we know it today, the Western mass education system that we are all a product of, has been shaped by two conflicting impulses, right? One is the goal of empowerment, liberation, democratization, whatever you want to call it, right? But very much at the same time, the contradictory impulse of control and ensuring that those in power never lost power, right? So this, whether we call it an assimilationist project or a civilization project from the perspective of First Nations people or colonization. And of course, all of us have been socialized by an education system that not only the colonial project of domination and control, but pre-colonial Brahminical patriarchal traditions, right? That told us whose knowledge mattered, whose stories mattered, whose voices mattered. So in my experience, bringing those silenced histories, many of which you have shared, thank you. So, I think almost instantly transform the terms of the debate in the classroom, because for the first time, students from oppressed groups see themselves, right? that they exist, because most of their schooling has been a process of invisibilization and silencing. So, but the reaction of students from privileged backgrounds is also very interesting, isn't it? Because this history then calls into question the world as they know it, right? And certainly, what I like to work with in history is sort of systematically showing how the education system, the policies, the reforms, the decisions that have been made through time have always operated to protect the interests of the privileged. And in India, of course, it's upper caste, upper class, patriarchal, and so forth. And which calls into question this dominant discourse of merit that we have, right? That we use to justify where we are today and the privileges and our experiences, right? That this was earned. I worked for it. This was, a level playing field. And so it's very interesting what these, what I call, these radical histories or subaltern histories do when you bring it into a learning space, and how, people from different locations react to these subaltern histories. So thank you for sharing your resources. So my next question builds, is a variation on the same theme. What other concepts have you personally found to be useful in the way, in the work that you do? I think this time I'm going to ask Vikrant to go first, please.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Nisha. So, well, my approach is a very straightforward, direct kind of working in the field that I work, is a kind of a story-based strategy that I employ. Both as a filmmaker and an academic, I always find storytelling to be a kind of a crucial tool to effectively reach out, communicate, and create a fruitful dialogue. And for me personally, reality-based stories, stories of the oppressed, story of oppression, personal reflections, and reflexive storytelling is certainly useful. As I mentioned, I started using storytelling approach since my first student production, and till date, I find the approach, it is an effective way to assess, analyze, and work towards informing, educating, and creating awareness. Sometimes it is direct storytelling method, and at times indirect, with multiple layers. And that's another thing, that multiplicity, or that kind of, how you create those kind of things, trying to share those kind of stories. And these days I'm seeing so many kind of new storytellers, especially from South India, of course, from Tamil Nadu and Malayalam film industry, coming out with some strong filmmaking. Last night I was watching this film called Sarpatta Parampara, about boxer, and the kind of layers it had. Wow, it just blew my mind. I thought that was amazing, the way P. Ranjit's particular films are. Another mode that I utilize is participatory story making, to empower individuals and communicate a more nuanced identity, also remediate, of their shared selves. My own inspiration comes from many of these storytellers, either through their books, films, or interviews. And all at the heart of all these things lies a story. Again, as I said, stories of oppression, subjugation, discrimination, otherizing, outcasting, yet the payoff is mostly centered around motivating, educating, agitating, activating, and finding new ways to challenge the age-old systemic caste discrimination and oppression.
Thank you for sharing these powerful pedagogical strategies, Vikrant. Mudit, may I request you to go next?
Yeah. So I borrow a lot of my theorization from the ongoing discussions that I have in personal spaces and in professional spaces. But I'm going to address one key term that comes almost always in any discussion around caste or jati. I'm going to address the term merit. And when we talk about caste, or when we talk about the source of caste, we say that it is the Vedic scriptures. And the defenders say that it is a merit-based system and anyone can be anything. And the opposers say that it is not, it is a birth-based inherited system. Even I agree, I completely agree with the opposers, and I have read it, so I can constructively agree with facts. The thing that the scriptures prescribe are called varnas, and these are statuses, which are non-existent anymore. Nobody identifies with their varna effectively, except for Brahmins. Everyone else, even though Brahmins also have jatis within them, jatis and sub-jatis and whatever. It's the communities outside of the Brahminical tiny sliver of the population, 2-3%. Those are all divided into jatis. And so then we need to understand why that kind of division occurs, how it occurred, and why is it so graded? Why someone is above someone else, and who did that? Like Nisha had asked earlier as well. And like the theorization that I have building on is that this kind of graded nature comes from the homogenization that a Brahmin brings to any discussion by calling all of these people Hindus. When we do not even have a definition for who a Hindu is. And this is especially prevalent in the diaspora. Like, what is a Hindu? Who is a Hindu? Do we ever self-reflect? Ever? Like, and do we ever make this distinction of what is a varna? Why certain jatis are either included in a certain varna or are adjacent to a certain varna? For example, Patels in Gujarat, I'm from Gujarat, are not included in any varna, but they are Vaishya adjacent, so they identify as Baniyas. Does their upper caste nature make them irrelevant, make their culture irrelevant? No, but it does bring into light their oppressive nature and their collaboration with Brahmins and Kshatriyas or Kshatriya jatis in oppressing people who they think are below them, so they have dehumanized them. Which brings me to the problem that when you are in a classroom, why a certain person from an oppressor caste thinks that it is okay to say that reservation are bad. The source of that is the belief that scriptures guaranteed you a certain varna by your merit. It was never that. Your scriptures were written deliberately in a weird way. So you could say that you could imply that you have inherited your varna or your jati by birth, but they're also weirdly obfuscated so that you can imply in a public conversation setting that you have to do everything by merit, when nothing is done by merit in India, and which is why we also have to understand that it is not really a civil society. Yeah, like the otherization that Vikrant brought up this is the mechanism to it. And anytime anyone says that the scriptures, whatever they prescribe, is being done by merit, needs a lot of interpretation in a contemporary sense, also then need to self-reflect where they stand and what they stand to gain from that kind of interpretation. So yeah, I hope I didn't make it too complicated.
Thank you, Mudit. That's what Q&As are for. So thank you. I think that's Kanika, please. Right?
Thank you, Nisha. I think I'm the odd one out here because when the kind of research I do mostly, which is in marketing discipline, it's really untouched by any of the conversations we are happening today about caste. I mean, if you read a basic Kotler textbook, there is all sorts of acknowledgement except caste system, and it's so distant. So one of the communications that has become my main research interest within the transformative service research discipline, as I was saying in the introduction, is to integrate these theories on caste system and demonstrate to the so-called Western world of what they're missing out by not knowing about the caste conversation, how they are limiting the marketing perspective, the business implications by speaking to a very specific audience and not being inclusive. So if you can have a racial conversation within marketing, you can surely extend the caste theories. And so one of the papers, as I'm writing, and the submission is very soon, so I'm going to work on that, is the social dominance perspective that I'm writing to this special issue. And we did an interesting study on microfinances in India. And this is a top microfinance institute in India based on Eunice's philosophy, the Nobel laureate, and we collected online data. All I did in the data was, in the last 3 months, I asked them to give me the data of applicants who were rejected in the loan, right? And from those rejections, I was able to identify the names of these applicants. I was able to shortlist that 60% of the rejections of the loans were, as Nisha is nodding her head, were from women in backward classes. And so here's a peerization that I'm trying to bring in, including caste conversations in a financial service, which is an inclusive service. So this is probably the communications I've been having through my publications, and it's become kind of my identity now, is involving scholars to look into how caste can deprive people of essential services. And here we are not talking just about financial services, which is one example. The Black Lives Matters movement that happened is a form of, is sort of a reflection of those discriminations. So services that we marketers have created have now started to discriminate in different forms. Within our context is, of course, the caste, and that's the peerization I take.
Thank you, everyone. A pedagogical strategy that I like to use is, every learning space has a difference, has a diversity of perspectives, and we pay token, lip service to the fact that, all of our social spaces have a diversity of perspectives. And going back to sort of this theme I've been talking about, how have we been socialized, and how deep do supremacist ways of thinking go, right? Whether in our educational systems or in the other places where we get our culture and our identity and so forth. And so I've learned from people much better than me to talk about the difference between dialogue and debate. Because debate is, again, something we have inherited from the Western knowledge tradition, where it's implicit hierarchies, and some forms of knowledge are better than others, right? And Western science historically has played a role in reproducing this hierarchy of knowledge with scientific racism and so forth, which has been used to silence all kinds of perspectives. So I like to sort of throw that in the mix, but also because it then leads us to uncomfortable conversations about what does it mean to truly listen. If we say that we are open to learning from new perspectives, if we say we're open to owning our privilege and our complicity, how then should these conversations and interactions change, right, on an interpersonal level? And then it gets really interesting, because we have to talk about power and privilege explicitly, and we can't conveniently hide behind facts and statistics, right, which are sort of in the Western knowledge paradigm. Those are set up as the gold standard of knowledge. And if you can't convey your perspectives through certain statistics and facts, then your knowledge doesn't count, right? So that's an interesting and useful pedagogy for stirring the pot and getting to think about, getting people to recognize that power is always present when we're making knowledge together. But of course, when we start talking about power, then inevitably there's resistance. And so that will be my final question to the panel. Could you please talk about one form of resistance that you frequently encounter in doing this work? And I'm not talking about outright denial. That's the purpose of this conversation today, as we all agreed, is to move beyond the deniers. That's not who we're talking to today. So could you please share from your personal journeys a form of resistance that you've encountered and how you engage with it. Mudit, may I ask you to go first, please?
Yeah, it is actually quite bang on what you said, the axiomatic nature of our discussions. So we assume that there is a certain level of truth in our logic from where we start. Like, if you want to enter an IIT, you have to clear this exam. And so everyone needs to be at the same level of clearing that exam. And yeah, that is the quintessential assumption, that it is what you can do to get in, not what the institution can do to make itself more equitable. That we never question. And yeah, the whole, like, and the biggest form of resistance I face is exactly this, when people say that if you want equality, then why do you not assume that we are all equal? And I basically always respond with the fact that it's an assumption, and so it is wrong, that we're not all equal, not just in financial terms or in terms of our networks or our cultural capital, but we are unequal in terms of not being able to fight as equals. Like, when we have a debate, which you said, is this other person even taking me seriously? That is the inequality we are talking about when we talk about jati. And so, yeah, that kind of resistance always makes me a little queasy in any discussion, because it is a very difficult thing to push into people's brains, because that's just not how we've been brought up. We've always been brought up in a competitive environment. So we don't have a lot of fraternity. Even though it's written into the constitution, it is very difficult to inculcate, especially because we're all always fighting each other for the limited resources that we have assumed are limited. And so, yeah, the best way I engage with it is I always ask people to go back and read their scriptures, always. And yeah, people say they don't have time sometimes. Sometimes people say that they have read interpretations, and I always say that it is never the same, which also goes for Baba Sahib's writing. If you want to read Baba Sahib's writings, do not read an interpretation of it. Go and read the actual work. That applies to all of our scriptures as well. What is the morality that we're talking about of our entrance criteria, of our exit criteria, of our representation criteria, of our equality or inequality, our birth inherited rights and stigmatizations? All of that is in there, or maybe it is not. If it's not, then our discussion is irrelevant. But since we're having the discussion, we do need to find out if all of these things are there or not. And yeah, when I say our scriptures, I mean Vedic scriptures, because those are the dominating forms of, they basically define what kind of hierarchy exists, not just in the Hindu religion, but all religions. So yeah.
Thanks, Mudit. Kanika, would you go next, please?
Yes. Oh, Nisha, where do I start when it comes to resistance? You've kind of, your last question should have been the first question, and that would literally be a webinar in its own. Resistance on subtle levels that I would like to raise here, and isolate this to just my profession, because that's where I started off. And I think in my introduction, I said the first resistance I get is getting the publications out in top tier journals that speak about caste system. And just to raise a thought here, if you look at the top tier publications in marketing, Journal of Marketing Sciences, there is not a single paper, not a single over, these prestigious journals that have raised the issue of caste system amongst businesses. So that's one. We get rejections, desk rejections. That's the first level of resistance. We also get resistance as early career scholars. A theme that I would like to raise here. from collaborators, because you're early in your career, you're trying to collaborate with people, whoever are within the topic. And if you look at the Indian scholars who do discuss caste issues or Indian based issues, want to suppress caste situations. And I was working on a project on modern slavery, which is nothing but exploitation of workers in supply chain. And a data of mine, emerged, which is not a surprising fact to the panel here, is about discrimination amongst the lower communities, amongst slave workers. So the so-called better caste people get better jobs than the Dalit workers in the supply chain. And when I raised that point in my article, my collaborator refused and kept, rejecting that particular part on the paper. And at that moment, I had to surrender to this, because I also wanted to, build up the trajectory and the broader questions. But at some stage, of course, of the R&R, I was able to attach that point there. So that's the first level of resistance to writing. When I compare this to Baba Saheb, I believe the reason he was able to speak to a larger audience is also Baba Saheb never stayed in the mainstream media. He published his own work because his work was not getting recognized in conferences as inhalination of caste. So that's the first level of resistance. The second, oh my God, resistance in social media and conferences, where you get attacked when you present a paper on caste situations by people who should be sympathetic to this issue if you call yourself an Indian. So that's a second level of vocal resistance we face in the academic, so-called educated community. Third resistance I have been facing, and I would like to raise this, is a Facebook page in Australia called Indians in Sydney. A very unique story that I would like to share, since this is the last question. Section 377 verdict was passed in India, which was about, giving some rights to gays in India. And so there was a post that was put on Indians in Sydney saying, we are welcoming gay rights, but caste system does still exist. And it was something I could connect with. And so I immediately reacted to the post saying, yes, that's a valid point. And there you go. I was attacked by the Indians in Sydney saying, how can you talk about caste situations? You should go back home if you want to talk about this. And so the questions I asked was, well, I'll stop talking the day a Pandit starts working as a manual scavenger, and a manual scavenger comes home to do your Ganpati Puja, because it was right at the Ganpati festival time. And they were like, we don't mind, but you people, the reference to me was you people are. So I feel like an outsider here amongst Indians in Sydney, been called you people. And this word you people has been a word of resistance to me in conferences, has been the you people resistance in publications, as in, what you are representing a very minority story. It's not, it's an outside story. It's not a mainstream story. So where should I start? This is just an initial teaser. Resistance on multiple levels to survive and thrive and be in this community. So yeah.
Thank you, Kanika. You're on. We'll do another webinar just on resistance. I'll hold you to that. And thanks, to both you and Mudit for giving such powerful examples of how this is not just individual, interpersonal problems and biased ways of thinking. This is a system of oppression. I'll repeat the comment. Dilpreet, you go next.
Yeah. Oh boy, I've made some enemies in Australia already in just these past 3 years. I'm not a very smart business person, if you ask me, because no one wants to work with South Asian Today because we're too political for them. I think in the last year that I've run South Asian Today, all the anti-caste stories that we've done has been met with hate on social media or in my DMs. You're giving a bad name to Hindus and you're giving a bad name to Indian people by publishing these stories. Caste and all is not here in Australia. And then you see something called ABS, Australian Brahmin Samaj or something, running fully, has a website, has its own matrimonial. And it does events, and it's completely only for Brahmin by Brahmin people. So all that is okay, but dare you talk about anything anti-caste, and dare you call it out. So I completely feel I think heard with Kanika, because I also feel very, very alienated in South Asian and Indian communities in Australia, because I would say anything remotely close to caste and I'm like, Dilpreet, so all the time she's talking about caste, she has nothing better to do. So that's what I mean. Like with South Asian today, sometimes people tell me that maybe you should take a step back and maybe you should, talk about cultural things, talk about Bollywood for a change, talk about, chai for a change, and then you'll make friends. You've made enemies already. And I think that's where the resistance comes in, because make me, right? I'm not going to stop. And I think there will come a time where, I will find an audience, and I have found, quite a loyal audience already that I'm really grateful for. But I think the more we continue, the more we reach people who want to read these stories, who want to know these stories, who want to participate in these stories. And I'm quite a crude journalist, to be very honest. I'm not a people pleaser at all. Again, I'm not sure if it's a strength or a weakness, really unsure. But, it's some stories are not meant for some people, and that's totally okay. Not every story on South Asian today is going to make you feel better about being brown. I'm sorry, like my publication is just not the publication for you if you're looking for stories that make you feel better about yourself, right? Some stories are going to make you uncomfortable, and some people are just not ready for it. And it's also not my responsibility to make them, be ready for it. My responsibility is to publish stories. My responsibility is to have conversations with anti-caste leaders across the world and, bring their stories to the forefront. I would any day do a movie review on, Gili Puchi, then Singham or whatever. So, the idea of the mainstream is very capitalist, right? What is the mainstream? Who is the mainstream? But in the diaspora, the mainstream South Asian outlets are, Bollywood and Mehndi and Sari, and that's what they want to do, because there's this nostalgia with the diaspora, right? Ki, oh, my motherland, my country. This romanticization, I think is the word, of India and the culture prevents diaspora from, taking part in anti-caste conversations, and makes them really angry when you do anti-caste stories, because suddenly you're making them look bad. And I think that's not my responsibility to make anyone look good or to make anyone look bad, right? And I think that in itself is resistance. I would like to think so. To just keep moving and to just, my work is to amplify. My job is to amplify stories, and that's what I'm going to do. And, along the line, I'll have to call out Indians in Australia. So be it. I honestly got nothing to lose. So that's resistance, I suppose.
All power to you, Dilpreet. Vikrant, would you go next, please?
Yeah, thanks, Kanika and Dilpreet. And you both, put some valid points and, things that really makes me excited to not only to hear, but I also appreciate the kind of work you two are doing, and some pointers that Mudit also made. So really, really things, that's the need for these kind of conversations, that lots of times we are, working on our own and not finding people to collaborate. And one of the things that I find within the community is the internal resistance, the feeling of shame of one's own identity that takes a long time to overcome. And I'm going to share some of my own personal stories here. So the discrimination that I, as a privileged person, in India, faced was negligible to, compared to the ones who have gone through it on a daily basis. Yet I found myself to be a target of caste discrimination during my school days or university days, till the time I accepted who I was and started challenging people on their mindset and fighting for my own rights. This was a turning point for me. That was something new, the privilege that was bestowed on me, all the material things in life that I got, led many to confuse me as someone who comes from a higher caste, okay? So that was the thing. Oh, Vikrant, oh, he's got a motorcycle in school, in college days, or he has access, oh, his father is an IAS officer, or his mother is so the big of, suddenly the association was mostly about what material things that I have. And that would make me not a Dalit. Okay, and that was the thing. And then at occasions, my gait, my walking style made me, made a few ask me, direct a question like, oh, you look like a Rajput. Are you one? Well, my response would be, is there a monopoly on how you walk? And is a person's gait categorized within the caste structure? But the general understanding is that a Dalit should be meek, lean, frail, unconfident, so stereotyped that it is beyond problematic. That's what people are thinking, that's what a Dalit is. I have so many anecdotes or stories about these experiences, And as a professional in India, I was aghast how people judge others on their appearance and class, So appearance, so, if you are dark, so we talk about casteism, but in India, racism is also another thing. Everything is about your appearance in terms of if you are a Gora or you're Kala. So that's another kind of racism issue also associated with caste. And that's another thing to really explore. In one of the colleges that I taught in India, my first initial meeting with the principal, she outrightly made a comment, which made me very uneasy. She said, oh, the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe students are really terrible here. I totally disagreed with her comments, and I said, why are you even saying something like that? Is there some kind of data that you found? And she got a little uncomfortable and she moved to another point. And this was the initial meeting, and I didn't want to also, come out as someone, and as an activist. So I also, brushed that aside, but then that was the thing. So all these kind of issues, that how a principal is actually judging their students on the basis of their caste and their tribe, it really, really made me uneasy. And that's what is happening in every other institute back in India, where the principal, and then I'll give you another example. There's this principal from a prestigious Mumbai university visiting deacon. This is in 2007. I was in my class teaching, and one of my colleagues, he comes, hey, Vikrant, we have got someone from India and I would like to introduce this person to you. I was like, oh, wow. I came out of my class and there's this principal from prestigious Christian missionary university back in Mumbai. And then she says, and she introduces herself to me and I introduce myself to her. I said, my name is Vikrant Kishore. And then she says, Vikrant Kishore? Kishore who? And then I couldn't think of anything. I said, hey, listen, I'm Indian. That's it I can say. And then sorry, I have to go for my class. And I went there. And after leaving this woman and this friend of mine, this colleague of mine, who's an Australian, he said, Vikrant, did I experience my first casteist behavior? I said, yes, this is those kind of things that you see, you are unable. And this happens so much. So, it's kind of, these are the problems. So there are resistance and roadblocks at each step. A recent podcast, an article on ABC in which I featured, when shared on various online Australian Indian groups, similar to what Kanika experienced, saw a kind of backlash, people putting in nasty comments, some saying there is no casteism in Australia. Well, because it's only upper caste who comes to Australia. So that's why we can't have casteism here. Okay, that's the kind of mindset. Okay, so some asking, oh, if you feel there is casteism in Australia, go back to where you come from. Okay, some being abusive, some taunting. So do you want reservation in Australia? Hey, doctor, are you a reservation doctor? So how do you respond? How do you fight these? Well, best is to collect these and use it in your storytelling. Most importantly, it is the wider community in Australia that needs to acknowledge and understand that casteism and caste prejudice, they need to acknowledge it. They need to understand that. And that is what my aim is, to let others know about this discriminatory practice, to open them to the discussion on this vile ancient division that still many practice without any shame. I want people to proactively engage in these deliberations, to be able to read and assess that this is as worse as racism. This is very similar to the kind of oppression that the indigenous Australians go through and are fighting till date. Thus, a better understanding of the diverse South Asian population and acknowledgement of that and the division that it has needs to be understood, acknowledged, and an attempt to fight it before it raises its ugly head in Australia specifically. So that's it from my side.
Thank you, Vikrant. That was so powerful. All of you, thank you for sharing as honestly and powerfully as you have. What you've talked about has, mapped all the different, what resistance looks like. Often we don't recognize resistance for what it is, particularly, I think, when engaging with people who present as progressive or open-minded and so forth. So there are all these, the trolling is very easy to recognize for what it is, the attacks, but the subtle forms of resistance that are built into our institutions and our cultural practices, right? And each one of you name those, whether it's the publishing system or just the simple greeting rituals that go on when South Asians meet each other, or this just, the very, I think, gendered resistance, right? Dilpreet, that you put your finger on. Why can't you just be nice? Why can't we just talk about nice things, right? Let's talk about chai pakora and Bollywood, right? And whatever makes us feel good. And in that, I see a very clear, this is supremacist thinking. This is privilege, right? Because it's only when you have privilege that you are entitled enough to tell people what the conversation should look like, how you can talk, what you can say, what you should look like, how you should walk, all of that. So thank you. I agree. We need to talk about resistance much more. But at this point, do you have questions or comments for each other? We have one question that's come in from the audience and they wish to be anonymous. So I'll put it out there. They're asking all of you to sort of talk a little bit more about why there is this resistance in your personal analysis. So I'll just put that out there. If you want to talk to it, you can.
So I can answer the resistance question just from the perspective I laid out here about publishing in top tier journals and being a business academic, the marketization of the issue. If you look at Black Lives Matters versus caste system in India, there is clearly no glamour attached to it. I mean, I'm not saying Black Lives Matters is glamorous, but the attention it gets from social media and from companies, who started to then change the models on their packaging in order to reflect the movement and saying we stand by this movement. See, that has not come from corporates in India. The Tatas and the Birlas have never recognized caste to be a serious issue as corporates in the Western world. I mean, if you look at the Cisco case, is a clear example that the only way they can react to this is by suppressing the issue. And so some point this, there is resistance because of not getting the mainstream media. So of course, Dilpreet, as she said, and Vikrant's work, where they give attention to these topics in mainstream media is a valued job that you are doing of raising these issues, speaking about this. Even the webinar today that we are having, there was a podcast in Melbourne Uni not too long ago about caste issue where, we had some serious conversations there. There's just recently in Journal of Business Ethics, which is a very global kind of a broader journal, has presented a special issue on this. So here we're seeing an early traces of the discussion, still not to this level at what I would expect. There is resistance, as I said, because who holds the conversation, who is monitoring this conversation. So the elites in India, if they sit on the review boards, or if they are editors of top tier journals in mainstream media like Times of India or any of the Australian papers that you see, they don't find the excitement on the topic. So probably that's where the resistance comes of raising these issues in top tier journals. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from Bala Sugavanam. Bala, you should now be able to turn your mic on and ask your question. You don't have to come on video. That's fine. Are you there, Bala?
Hello, yeah. Thank you so much. There are a couple of things that sort of like resonated with me. The first one was something that Mudit mentioned was like, what is Hinduism like and who is a Hindu? That's something that I think about as well, because growing up, I'm not one of from the families that worship Vishnu or Shiva, or I don't see myself being defined by the casteist sort of like Hindu system. But then, like the gods and goddesses that my family, or the people from my my state, I'm from Tamil Nadu, and like the Ammans and Iyengars and not Iyengars, Ayanars and those kind of gods that we don't see here. You've got temples for Vishnus or and stuff like that. That's something that I struggle with or try to reconcile. And the other one that I want to talk about was that Dilpreet touched on was when you hang out in spaces here, especially in Sydney or in the rest of Australia, it's predominantly like Hindu or Bollywood Hindi speaking sort of like space. How do we sort of like amplify the voices from the Dravidian communities, people who speak Malayalam or Kannada or Tamil or Telugu for that matter? So how do we, sort of like amplify these voices and people from these communities, in Australia or, everywhere? Like, how do we amplify those voices and not just the Indo-Aryan, speaking communities?
I can address the technical bit about what Indo-Aryan languages are. And yeah, it's basically the family of language that is spoken in mostly North India and traces back its origin to Central Asia. Whereas Dravidian languages are older and migrated from maybe Central Asia, maybe the region around Balochistan to the south of India way before the Aryan settlerism started. But yeah, I think someone else should answer the bit about why the supremacy of the North Indian.
I can speak to it a bit. Bala, you're pointing out a global trend, and this is something, we've talked a great deal about the oppressor or the privileged caste, but that's not to suggest that these dynamics don't play out within whatever word you're comfortable with, progressive, activist spaces. And so, I mean, the lesson I've taken, lessons I've learned through my work is not to romanticize activist spaces as well. There are always these dynamics playing out. These some consciously or unconsciously, people are deciding who's included, who's not, who can speak, who can't. The terms, the language, if you don't speak a certain way, don't use a certain language or jargon, activists don't listen to each other. And I've experienced that over and over again this is not to put any activist community on the spot, but feminists do it to one another, people of color do it to one another. So this is something, so we have to consciously, those of us who commit to creating inclusive, egalitarian spaces, have to pay attention to every part of the dynamic. And that's why process matters, right? We all want to get somewhere, we're fighting for something. And often we say, some things we don't have time for. Process doesn't matter. So when we get there, when we win this campaign, then we'll pay attention to that issue. And I think your question is raising that, that fundamental issue, that process really matters. The journey to wherever we want to go really matters. And if if our struggle is reproducing some of these exclusionary tendencies or these hierarchies, then that's a problem. So we need to continuously introspect. That's the lesson I've learned from the social movements that I work in solidarity with.
One more point I wanted to add. Statistically, Dravidian culture is more Bahujan than North India. North India probably has a higher population of Savarna people, which is basically, when I say Savarna, I'm talking about the Brahman Varna and the business classes, Vaishya and the Kshatriyas. Also, I think North Indians in general are more in number across the diaspora in Western countries, whereas South Indians probably are more in the Middle East. So I think the numbers matter as well. But then there are other sinister elements that are working under the surface. Like, for example, a MasterChef winner in Australia can be Bengali also, can be Bangladeshi also, can be Indian also, can be Jamindar also, can be North Indian also, can be non-North Indian also, can be eclectic also, and can come across as humble also. Like all of these, this fluid nature of North Indian identity to be whatever they want to be seen as. But yeah, it's just a theory then.
Thanks.
I will, yeah,
Vikrant, yeah, would you like to speak to that?
yeah. Primarily as a kind of a film academic, I generally see, and my area of research is Indian cinema. But when I say Indian cinema, it's mainly mainstream Indian cinema or Bollywood to be precise. So, and of course, I have different definitions of Bollywood. So I use Bollywood as an international kind of terminology, I include all the mainstream cinema of India. If I use it in India's perspective, then I use it as a Hindi cinema specific thing. But still, it is very Hindi cinema oriented. There was a big discussion around, does it represent South or is it just representing Bollywood or big Bollywood stars? And what about alternate cinemas and things like that? And that conversation is still going on. It's not that. So my conscious kind of move was, and understanding was, that we need to represent as many languages from India and we need to have those conversations. People are doing that in, different pockets here in Australia. But, and as I see, there's a question coming in about, forming a kind of a, activist group or people who can raise voice. And this is one thing. Recently, I've been in a group where I've been having those kind of interaction with, Dravidian activists. In fact, so many people, my friends and family, they have been having those kind of interactions on these kind of films. So I think there is a huge space for that. And we have to constantly push ourselves to build those kind of dialogues with each other.
A lot of academics that, in the context that I'm speaking in, have been white Australian academics. And I personally find it to be a disservice that, people are going to talk about South Asia, going to talk about India, but are going to take a step back, when it comes to talking about caste. If you're going to talk about a particular continent and a particular culture, then you'll have to be a little bit fearless. I'm sorry. And, certain situations I've seen, I've felt very awkward that, they will step back and they will not participate, or they will not publish a certain thing just because, they'll get some calls from people higher up, because, Indian leaders, especially in the, in the embassies and everything, they also don't want you to talk badly about India, right? So there's a lot of fear and intimidation. But I think if academics are going to talk about a country, then they can't pick and choose. That's my personal observation, not as an academic. It's awkward when they pick and choose that what is a safe thing to talk about, what is not a safe thing. You can't do that. If you're going to pick up a country, then you'll have to stick with certain things and you'll have to take chances, and as you do that, of course, activism will grow and you'll make allies and solidarity will happen. But if you're going to take a step back, how will that happen? It's impossible then.
So India has a scheduled caste commission, which makes a list and maintains a list of communities that were treated as untouchables. They're called the scheduled caste. India also has a Anusuchit Janjati or Scheduled Tribe Commission, which maintains a list of communities that were the original custodians of the lands that were finally settled on by Aryans. And we also have a Backward Classes Commission that makes a list of communities who they thought are underrepresented, which was made by Dr. B.P. Mandal, who I had cited earlier. Together, these communities, the Adivasis or the scheduled tribe and Dalits or the scheduled caste make up more than 25% of India's population. Backward classes make up more than 52% of India's population. That's close to 80%. There are still nomadic communities in India that have no recognition as such. This division also exists across religions. So if you take up the issue of minorities, which was a question, there is a there was a class structure that religion took in the subcontinent, but eventually, because of how the system is, it evolved into a caste system. And like communities were named after what kind of occupation they inherit from. The only people who are not listed, who are not studied, who don't study themselves, are the rest of them, which probably make up less than 12% of India's population. They are a majority in the diaspora. So yeah, that's one of the biggest thing that we need to understand, that a lot of Indian students here don't understand and not equipped with, because it's just not taught in India. So it is really hard for them to be taught the same thing here. But yeah, like they will call themselves, when they get here, especially second generation Indians, when they get here, they call themselves immigrants when they are not. Like if they're from an oppressor caste, they are settlers, and they are no different from any other white person that has settled here in the last 200 years. So yeah, these are some important statistics to keep in mind when you evaluate and you consider why these people do not study themselves and prefer studying scheduled caste and scheduled tribe people, because of their complicity in the whole project.
We're starting to build a network, because I mean, the short answer is yes. We, of course, we can draw on comrades in the US and the UK who've been doing this work for decades, but the Australian political culture and culture of politics is unique, and we need to develop resources and strategies specific to where the Australian neoliberal corporate academy is today. And as I think, and where the broader conversation is, just sort of about what Dilpreet's work is about, the lack of diversity in Australian media. In my own field of education, the lack of Asia literacy has been documented, right? Researched and documented, even though this is a curriculum priority in the Australian school curriculum. And it's not, it's all Asians who are misrepresented, and we've seen this in the COVID pandemic, the racism experienced by Chinese. So I don't think we can set the Australian Academy on a pedestal. I'd like to believe that there are progressive allies and impulses and relationships and networks to be built. I agree with Kanika that some translation work has to be done. People like Vikrant have been fighting this fight since they got here, and have been lucky enough to be supported in it. But there are other academics who don't have that support. So yes, I mean, the short answer, there's much work to be done. And thank you again. I should start wrapping up. We've gone way over time, but all the panelists have been kind enough to stay with us. So thank you again, Kanika, Dilpreet, Vikrant, and Mudit, for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and your strategies. And I look forward to more conversations of this kind. And thanks to everyone, the attendees. So thanks to all of you who lasted for 2 hours with us. And please keep stay tuned. We'll let you know when a recording's up and when more things are happening in this space. Would anyone else like to make any closing remarks? I'm going to stop here. Yes, Mudit?
Yeah, just wanted to say that it's important to hold accountable people who speak for the community, people like Bhaskar Shankara, who runs Jacobin, or Pankaj Mishra, who writes radical socialist fiction. Yeah, it's important that Western scholars also hold them accountable on their cultural privilege. If you are an academic and you're white, you can still supervise South Asian students. Don't say you can't, because then they'll end up in the clutches of another Brahmin scholar, another Brahmin academic who will, prune their research and cut out all the radical bits of it. So yeah, just keep that in mind.
Thank you, Mudit. Shall we say good night, everyone? Stay well, stay safe.
Good night. Take care. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nisha. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.